Good evening, everyone. I'm glad to see all of you with me tonight, and we're going to study Joseph and his brothers. An interesting story. And by the way, this story is the story of Israel and how Israel came to be, why, and how they were going to be treated. I haven't talked about some of the bad things that have happened. I haven't talked about Lot and how he was living, what kind of a situation he was in. I didn't talk about him as Sodom and Gomorrah getting destroyed, his wife looking back, turned upon a pillar of salt. I haven't talked about uh, his daughters sleeping with him, with Job. I haven't talked about the Judah and him sleeping with his, or I won't talk about him sleeping with his um, daughter-in-law, daughter-in-law as a prostitute, which is in this story. That there are several things like that have happened that we're not going to talk about simply because of the fact that it's not germane to how the Israel came about. It's an interesting stories and interesting things, and powerful when we get to if we're ever going to do a story on losers of the Old Testament instead of heroes. That'd be pretty bad, wouldn't it? But these are giving us a great foundation to how the Christ came about, why God used Israel, and so on and so forth. Well, let's start with Joseph and the fact that Jacob had his sons, his 12 sons, and you'll notice that Joseph was his favorite. In fact, he was so much his favorite because you remember he loved Rachel, Jacob did, and married Rachel, but who did he get? He got Leah instead, so then he had to work longer for Rachel again. So he worked 14 years for Rachel, and he was very much in love with her, and somehow he really captured, she really captured his heart. So when finally she gave him a child, his other sons were older, and this firstborn of Rachel he named Joseph, and he liked him so much that he embellished him with more and showed favoritism, exactly like his mother and father did. Uh, um, um, Jacob's mother and father, Isaac and Rebekah, and how they showed favoritism. So here, Jacob's doing the same thing. Now, it's understandable, and at the same time, it's not commendable. So we need to learn from that and see what's happening with that. Well, all it did was stir up trouble between him and his brothers. In fact, God gave him a dream, two dreams. And the first dream he gave to Joseph was about these sheaths of grain, these stalks of grain that were standing out there in the field, and we're all cutting down grain. He said, and we looked, and all of a sudden, my sheath stood up, and the others all bowed down. And boy, the brothers didn't like that because what he was saying was that they were going to bow down to him. Well, that kind of irritated them. And then later, he has another dream about the same situation, but this time it's the sun, moon, and stars all bowed down to him. Oh, and then his father said, "Wait a minute, are you saying um, that that I'm even going to bow down to you, not just your brothers?" And it even made Jacob mad. So here was a guy who was specially treated, given more, even though he didn't deserve it, and given insight as to what was going to come to him, how he was going to rise up and actually be a blessing to the world, and the world's going to bow down to him. So it is with the nation of Israel. Now, the brothers got mad, and he goes out one day, and his father sends him out, and he gives a bad report of what they were doing. Obviously, Joseph was pretty sharp in some kind of administrative role and very capable. And he'd send him out there, check, see how they're doing. He comes back with a bad report, and the brothers got mad. They just hated him, and hate grows until you do something about it. And so they sat there and plotted how to get rid of him. They didn't like the fact that he had this fancy coat. They didn't like the fact that his father treated him different than he treated them. And you know, the oldest is supposed to take over after the father's dead. And here Joseph was really and truly in control of that, of Jacob's family. And so what they did was, one day Jacob sent him out again to look and see what the brothers are doing. He goes out there, and when he does, they catch him, they capture him, they throw him in a pit. And before they excuse me, before they throw him in the pit, they take his coat off. They say, "You don't deserve this." And they sit around and think about killing him. They talk about killing him, and he says he's pleading for his life. He begs them not to take his life. And Judah hears it, and Judah thinks about it. He says, wait a minute, fellas. Let's think about this and see what we can do. He says, you know, what we could do is we could figure out some other way. Well, about that time, here's a caravan coming by going to Egypt, and Judah said, hey, I got it. Let's just sell him to those guys over there. Not only are we rid of him, but we'll even make money off of him. The other guy said, that sounds pretty good. We'll make money and sell him. So what they decided to do is just put animal blood on the coat. They'll take it back to his father, say he's dead, animalate him, and then they've got this big purse of money that they can use. And here he is, a strong, good-looking young man, and so this caravan of vagabonds was more than happy to take him and on down to Egypt to sell him. Joseph in Egypt. Let's forget about the other brothers for a minute. And remember, this is Joseph and Brothers Part 1, because there's a Part 2. Well, let's see what happens to Joseph. So Joseph goes into Egypt, and he is put up on the auction block, and he's sold off, and Potiphar buys him. Now, Potiphar's pretty well up there. You can imagine in any kingdom, there's a lot of roles for lesser men to play around the king, and Potiphar's one of them. We don't know exactly what he did, but that's who he was. And he comes in, he sees Joseph's capability, and he puts him in charge over his affairs. In fact, he puts him in charge over everything, so that Potiphar then can just do whatever he wants to do. It's vacation day every day. And while he's there in Potiphar's house, well, Potiphar has a wife, and she thinks she's pretty good looking, but for sure she thinks old Jacob's good looking. Potiphar's older, and maybe she's tired of some of his noises and attitudes and actions and things, and here's a new young hot guy, and she looks at him and she says, you know, he's strong and he's young and he's capable, and man, I want this guy. And so she reaches out and she says, let's take a look now. Here we are in chapter 39. And look what it says here in the last part of verse 6, chapter 39, verse 6. Now Joseph was a well-built and handsome. That's a pretty good description of who he was. And after a while, his master's wife, that would be Potiphar's wife, took notice of Joseph and said, "Come to bed with me." Boy, she doesn't beat around the bush. She says, "Get in here and come to bed with me." And look what Joseph said, verse 8, chapter 39, verse 8. But he refused. "With me in charge," he told her, "my master does not concern himself with anything in the house. Everything he owns he is entrusted to my care. No one is greater in this house than I am. My master has withheld nothing from me except you." Now see what he knows about marriage and what he knows about God is the marriage, the wife is for the husband for the wife. He's not going to mess around. But what does he say to her? "How then could I do such a wicked thing and what? Be against Potiphar? No, and sin against God." So he says, "No, I can't do that. I can't sin against God." She doesn't care about God. She cares about herself and what she wants. And day after day after day, she says no, till finally he grabs at her and he runs away, and all she gets is his coat. But she shows the coat to Potiphar and says, "Look what your man Joseph has done." And Joseph throws him in jail. Well, when he throws him in jail, in prison, sends him off to prison, and Joseph is meant to be there in prison. Now, that's hard for us to imagine. First of all, look how he screamed and cried and tried to get away from being killed, and he tried to get away from being sold into slavery, yet hated by his brothers he was, into slavery he was, and now into prison he is, and still all he thinks about is God. All he cares about in this is God. And so he's in prison and he starts doing what he does, wherever that is, and the head of the prison sees that he's pretty sharp, and he puts him in charge of the prison, and goes around making sure everything's okay, feeding the people, caring for them, whatever is necessary, bringing them in and out. He became just second only to the warden, and he's in charge of the prison, because God is with him. It says God didn't forget him. And notice he didn't forget God. I think the two go hand in hand. So then one day he's walking around the corner and he sees a couple of new guys that came in, and they're looking sad and dejected. He said, "Hey, what's up, fellas? Why are you so sad?" Well, the cupbearer, he says, "Well, I had a dream, and I don't know how to answer the dream." So he says, "Maybe you know how to answer the dream, Joseph. You're in charge here." And Joseph said, "Well, the interpretations are not from me. They are from God. And they belong to God." That's verse 8 of chapter 40. Interpretations are from him. So he said, "But if you tell me, maybe God will give us the interpretation." So the cupbearer told him what his dream was about. They saw 3 branches, they budded out, they grew fruit, and all of a sudden they had massive clusters of grapes on them. I squeezed them, and the juice fell into Pharaoh's cup, and I was able to give him the cup to Pharaoh, put it in Pharaoh's own hand. He said, well, Joseph says, well, this is what your dream means. The 3 branches means 3 days. And in 3 days, you're going to be back serving the Pharaoh wine again in his own cup. Wow, that's pretty good. The cupbearer thought, that's great. That's great interpretation. Well, the baker heard this and it was a good, favorable interpretation. So he says to him, maybe you could interpret my dream. And so Joseph said, well, tell it to me and maybe God will interpret it. So the baker said, well, I had a dream where I had 3 baskets on top of my head. And in the top basket, I had all kinds of breads and pastries and stuff for the king. And birds kept coming and eating the bread out of that basket. What does it mean? And Joseph says to him, well, let me tell you, it is what it means. In 3 days' time, the baskets mean 3 days. And in 3 days' time, you're going to be hung by the head, and the birds will come and eat your flesh. 2 different dreams, 2 different interpretations. And sure enough, 3 days later, it was Pharaoh's birthday, and Pharaoh reinstated the cupbearer and had the baker hung to death in a tree. So now Joseph says to the cupbearer when he starts to leave, don't forget me now. When you get up there and you're doing what you do, don't forget me. I'm going to be here still in prison. About 2 years later, the Pharaoh has a dream. And he has a special dream that really bothers him. He goes to sleep and he dreams of 7 fat, sleek, beautiful cows coming out of the Nile River and eating the luscious grass along the side. He wakes up and he thinks about this dream. What does this dream mean? He goes back to sleep and he has another dream. In this dream, there is a stalk of grain, and on the stalk is 7 fat heads of grain. And then beside it grows up another stalk of grain and had 7 heads, and they all get withered by the heat and the sun, and they reach over and eat the 7 fat heads, and they don't become any better. And I forgot to tell you, when the thin, skinny cows that came up out of the Nile after the fat, sleek cows, and they ate the fat cows, and they didn't get any fatter. So here we got 2 dreams that are real similar, different subjects, but exactly the same information. Well, he gets up and he's troubled about it. And the next day he calls all his wise men together. He says, here's my dream. What does it mean? And they're like, well, we don't know. And it scares them because they're supposed to know. And if they don't know, you know good and well that they're going to be in trouble. And so in chapter 41, he talks to them about this. And all of a sudden the cupbearer remembers, hey, I forgot. There's this guy down in prison. We had some dreams, me and the baker, and he told us exactly what was going to happen to those dreams, and they came true. Perhaps he could help you. So they called Joseph up out of the dungeon, and he gets shaved, he gets cleaned up, he comes in there before the Pharaoh, and the Pharaoh says, all right, now here's my dream. I'm having trouble knowing what this means. I had 7 fat cows and 7 skinny cows, and 7 skinny cows ate all the fat cows, and they didn't get any fatter. Had 7 fat grain heads and had 7 skinny grain heads, and they ate the fat ones, and they didn't get any better. What's going on? Now, Jacob said something, Joseph said something very interesting. He said, Joseph said, the dream, in verse 25 of chapter 41, and Joseph said to Pharaoh, the dreams of Pharaoh are one and the same. God has revealed to Pharaoh what it's about to do. The 7 good cows and 7 years, and the 7 good heads of grain are 7 years. It is one and the same dream. The 7 lean, ugly cows that came up afterwards are 7 years, and so are the 7 worthless heads of grain scorched by the east wind. They are 7 years of famine. So he's saying, God has shown Pharaoh what he is about to do. 7 years of great abundance are coming through the land of Egypt, to the land of Egypt. But 7 years of famine will follow them. Then all the abundance of Egypt will be forgotten, and the famine will ravage the land. The abundance of the land will be remembered, because the famine that follows will be so severe. Listen to this next part, verse 32. The reason the dream was given to Pharaoh in 2 forms is that the matter has been firmly decided by God, and God will do it. Now, did not Joseph have a dream given in 2 forms? So he knows he will rule, and his brothers will bow, and his father will bow. Isn't that interesting? So he goes on, and Pharaoh says to him, you know what? This guy's great, and he knows God, and he has told us that this is what God has decided and what God is going to do. He's got it straight, and so here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put him in charge of all Egypt. And he is going to be the one who takes over Egypt. So he puts the ring on his finger. I like this particular picture because, you know, it reminds us of how he's going to act on, because he puts a ring on his finger, he's going to act on Pharaoh's behalf. In fact, he is going to become as powerful as Pharaoh, and because Pharaoh's going to do what he says, he's actually more powerful than Pharaoh and made ruler of all Egypt. So he goes out there and he talks to the people and says, you're going to have an abundance. It's going to get great. Don't think anything. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to gather it all together and bring it to me. There's going to be a famine coming. God has spoken. And so he makes sure all of it's put away in the granaries and everything's safe there for the coming famine. 7 years they did this. And then the famine came. But during that time, Joseph was ruler of all Egypt. Can you imagine? Think of this now. The boy who was to be killed, was sold into slavery, becomes the ruler of Egypt. And everything that God had told him and promised him was now going to come true. And everything that God told Pharaoh was going to come true. And then the famine comes. So everything dries up and everything quits producing, and famine is there. Can't feed anything. They don't have anything to eat. And over in Canaan, well, not in Egypt, but over in Canaan, they had a problem. And because of this, God is going to bring the family of Jacob over to Egypt. And we're going to see how when 400 years later, when they leave Egypt, they leave as a nation, and they leave with a special purpose. and they're going to confirm the Old Testament that God had with Abraham, because there are a great number of people, now probably 1 to 1.5 million people, and they're going to get this land that he had promised them. And then the third part of the promise, that the Savior is going to come from them. So now, remember this story, because it's going to give us this this of Israel coming out of Egypt, or out of bondage, and into its glory. In all reality, this is the church, and exactly who we are today. We are Joseph and Joseph's family, and we've come out of bondage, and we're being blessed, and we're the ones with the truth, and we're the ones with the Savior, and we're the ones who can tell the world. What a great story this is. Now, next week we're going to talk about part 2, and that'll bring the family into Egypt. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.